In this presentation, I will discuss how to geocode with Python, or more specifically, how to convert addresses to latitude and longitude coordinates using the Geopy package. So suppose we are working on a software as a service product that relies on location data. And we've identified that a hard tech requirement is that we need to geocode addresses. Or in other words, we need to convert an address to latitude and longitude coordinates. For example, here I have an address in Wyoming, and these are the corresponding latitude and longitude coordinates. So now, how do we actually perform the geocoding? Well, there are several different geocoding services we can leverage. For example, Google, Here, Bing, and many other services are out there. And as a developer, you could pick a service and then send out API requests to the service you choose. However, a better solution is to leverage the Geopy Python package. Geopy is a library which provides implementations for many different geocoding services in a single package. So as a developer, you can just use Geopy rather than have your own implementation for different services, and also it'll be easier for you to switch between different geocoding services. And to install Geopy, we just do a pip install Geopy. So as I just mentioned, Geopy lets you work with different geocoding services. So first we'll start looking at the Nominatim service, and this is a free geocoding service, so it's a good way to get started with Geopy. And here you can see some basic code to geocode an address. So first, from the geopy.geocoders, we're going to import the Nominatim geocoding service. And here we've created a helper function to geocode the address for us. And the first thing we want to do is create an instance of the Nominatim geocoding service right here. And then with that instance, we're going to call the geocode function. Then in the geocode function, we're going to pass in our address. So address will be whatever address you want to geocode, and that'll be set to the query parameter. Then there's also an optional argument called country codes, which will help filter out which country you want to look through. And just to keep things simple, we'll say we want to search only in the USA. There are other optional arguments to the geocode function, which you can review here. Then once we get a location, we will return a dictionary with our latitude and longitude. If for whatever reason we're not able to get a location, then we'll return an error right here. And you can see here that once we pass an address, we're able to get the latitude and longitude coordinates. Now, one important thing to note here is for the Nominatim service, it is a hard requirement to pass in the user agent. For example, if I don't include it and I rerun, you're going to get a configuration error. And if you look further into the stack trace, the configuration error is related to the user agent. So if you use the Nominatim service, you must provide a user agent. Now, unfortunately, there are limitations to the Nominatim service. The two main limitations are that it has a low request limit and also does not provide full map coverage. For example, here, we're trying to geocode a new address, and this is a valid address. However, Nominatim is unable to geocode it. You can see here that when we try to call a function, it's returning this error. And this is a problem if you're building a customer-facing product, because we are unable to geocode an actual address. And so the recommendation here is you should only use Nominatim for your initial setup with Geopy. However, when you're building your MVP and you're building a full-blown product, it's better to use an alternative geocoding service. So an alternative geocoding service you could use is through the Here platform, or more specifically Here v7. And this is a really nice geocoding service because it allows for 30,000 free geocoding requests per month. So that should be sufficient for most MVP use cases. And also, this service provides significantly better performance and map coverage compared to Nominatim. So here's a very quick setup of how to use Here v7. So here we're going to import the here B7 geocoder. Then we're going to create an instance of it, and we have to pass in our API key to the here platform. And then we follow the same pattern as before, where with our instance we're going to call the geocode function, and here we're just going to pass in our address. And you can see here that we're able to convert this address into a latitude and longitude. However, the Nominatim service was not able to convert this one. Now, before actually implementing the geocode logic in your application, it's beneficial to take a step back and think if you actually need to geocode. For example, you'll see a lot of common SaaS problems that deal with location data will attempt to solve proximity problems like what is the nearest hotel or find all the hotels in the city. And so for these problems, we don't actually need the raw latitude and longitude coordinates, or in other words, we don't need to geocode. There are some alternative solutions that you can use that are much easier. For example, you can leverage geohashes. So geohashes is a very interesting concept regarding spatial data. At a really high level, you can think of breaking up the map into small pieces, and all entities within one piece of that map will have the same geohash value. And also, all entities that are nearby will have the same geohash value or have a geohash value with the same prefix. So if you're trying to solve a proximity problem, like the ones I described above, then you can store the geohash as a string column in your database and efficiently query that. The second alternative approach is to leverage third-party APIs, for example, the Here Search API or the Google Places API. These services will do all the hard work for you and abstract away all the low-level spatial data operations. And also, if you have to store the raw latitude and longitude coordinates in a database, then you most likely have to do it with a spatial aware database extension. For example, if you're using Postgres, then you need the PostGIS database extension. Now, using PostGIS is not super difficult, but it does add some extra complexity to your tech stack, and that's something to be aware of. So as engineers, we should step back to truly understand our problem and evaluate all the existing solutions before building anything. It could be possible that geocoding is not really a hard requirement for your product.